Hi, and welcome to Chronically, formerly known as Concussion Talk Podcast. My name is Lauren Zayaks,
I'm Nick Mercer.
and we're teaming up to talk about all things chronic illness. We'll still be talking about chronic concussion, but we're going to follow a lot of other journeys along the way. So make sure to subscribe and check back in. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Yeah, so when we were talking earlier about social support, I just kind of wanted to come back to that for a minute. It's interesting what you were saying about like finding that piece for the athlete, but for the regular person, for the rest of rest of society, often when a person, let me back that up. In the disability research, there's evidence that the longer you're out of work, the harder it is to return you to work, right? And that there's a whole host of reasons for that. And so we talk a lot about that in the clinic, where at some point they're not quite ready to go back maybe 20 hours a week, 40 hours a week. And so I'll actually give them homework where they have to go out into the wild and be present. So you have to go read your book in a coffee shop for an hour 3 times a week. You have to go volunteer. You have to go do these things. And so as you're talking about this cognitive reserve, that would be a fancier way of saying basically work hardening, right? But it's so important, and it's fascinating how fast this isolation, this loss of confidence that I can do, this loss of tolerance to being in society, it happens so fast that we actually have to give homework and explain why to a patient you have to go to a coffee shop and read so that you can hopefully go back to the office environment as soon as humanly possible. Do you have any more like evidence-based reasons for those functional observations that we have in the clinic?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I feel like a lot of the stuff that I've seen has been about like social support networks in the context of just healthy aging. And so a lot of that has shown that like people who have broader and deeper social networks tend to just fare better in aging. And, I think even anecdotally, I've seen this very often where you see the moment the person who's kind of aging experiences different setbacks that make it so that it's harder to engage in those social networks that they were previously engaging in, you do tend to see fairly steep cognitive declines. Even in short periods of time. I think just not having that kind of like social accountability, I think really is taxing on a person in general, and not having that social support to be able to talk about just even little things, even if you're not engaging in these deep, meaningful conversations, just having these short little, how's the weather looking type talks, or even my husband's grandfather had this wonderful network of folks in his retirement community who he would just engage with on a regular basis. He would walk around and just chit chat with people and have these kind of, catching up with people and catching up with the neighborhood gossip, all that good stuff, conversations. And I think that really did help him stay healthy longer. I think just having those people that count on you to be there, that, assume that they're going to be able to share information with you. Having that accountability piece, I think, is big. And also just the fact that, people are there, and knowing people are there, I think makes people feel more confident about how they're doing and their presence within their community and their network. I think that's a really big piece of that, both from like a small perspective of, your family network and having people there who you can count on for maybe bigger things, but also maybe a looser perspective of the people you see on your walk every day who wave to you or things like that. I think that's a big piece. And I'm sure coming back from extended periods of absence, easing back into that and knowing that, maybe those first few interactions are going to feel pretty challenging and they're going to not feel the same way that they were beforehand, but easing into it in ways that are kind of low stakes social situations, like you're saying, going to a coffee shop, ordering a coffee, sitting there by yourself and reading a book, but being surrounded by people and occasionally having to engage in those social interactions, I think is a big part of like priming the system back to be able to get back to the activity that used to feel very easy and effortless.
Yeah, I like that term, priming. I like that term, priming the system. Yeah. Or I'll tell patients like it's a muscle. Being social is a muscle, right? It's very important to human interaction and human development. And your window of tolerance to it goes away very quickly. And then, now that we've had the pandemic, you can use that. I mean, but pre-pandemic, I didn't really have like a global way to explain that to patients. But I mean, most people, not healthcare providers, but like most people were at least sequestered for a few weeks into their homes. It really wasn't that long in the grand scheme of things. And then humans were released back into the wild, and it was like no one had ever interacted in society before, right? And it was only a few weeks, but it usually gets a chuckle, which helps like break that like sadness that the patient has, but also it's a really easy way to understand that this happens to everybody. If a person is locked in their home and they're wiping their groceries down and they're having all this hypervigilance, once they're released back into the wild, they really have lost that key pieces that makes humans able to interact. It's not just because of your head injury. That of course makes it harder. It's harder to read things. Maybe your reaction time is slower, your ability to understand other people's nonverbal cues, but really you're not that special either, because it happened on a global level a couple of years ago, and we're still recuperating from it.
No, completely. And even just like you're saying, like basic social skills have changed so much, I feel like, and the expectations that you have for the way people are going to react have changed just because we all experienced some degree of that. Obviously, some people more so than others, but I think we did certainly all experience that idea that like we're coming back to socialization, and that can be really hard. And it's not something that's necessarily intuitive. It feels like it should be because it's something that, we used to do all the time. It feels like you should just be like riding a bicycle, but it's definitely harder than just getting back on a bike. So I agree. That sounds like a great recommendation for a patient. I like that.
Yeah, I know the one that people enjoy the MRI, fMRI, but before that, just like because you talk about the social interaction and the different sports, different life experiences, it all seems to me very much just different pathways. As long as you have the cognitive reserve and vestibular reserve, maybe, but just the plethora of pathways to do something, then your course will be a bit stronger more resilient than someone has like just one single tried and true pathway to enact in some sort of way. But that kind of also kind of goes towards say so CTE or Alzheimer's. You have a lot of interest in. Because I know because there's the tau proteins build up in both, but honestly they'll clog. They're basically clog is a non-technical term, non-scientific term, but yeah, the clog pathways of say someone who's has fewer pathways to think or to do whatever, do some sort of move muscle or whatever. But is there any sort of linkage between the CTE and Alzheimer's that you would think it would be important to look at or for future research?
Absolutely. I think certainly a lot of work with CTE has focused on ways in which it can be differentiated from Alzheimer's disease. I think that makes sense for many I guess newer identified diseases to be able to distinguish themselves as their own kind of unique set of experiences and pathologies and stuff. But I think we can learn a lot from overlaps between different conditions. I think there's certainly a lot of symptom-based overlaps that you see with existing neurodegenerative diseases. And so I think, I feel like treating the symptoms gets a bad rap kind of, but I think especially with things like Alzheimer's disease and CTE, I think the symptoms warrant treatment. And so I think when we know that there are certain types of interventions or I guess treatments that can help with Alzheimer's disease, especially with the more behavioral features of it. I think certainly finding ways in which we can transition those to see if they function similarly in individuals we suspect of having CTE or who have TES. I think this could certainly be a great way to show that kind of overlap. I don't think that it necessarily is going to show that they're the same by any means, but I think showing that it has a similar symptom benefit, I think would be huge for the field. And I think, an example of this is, I know in cognitive reserve, the big kind of motivating features behind cognitive reserve are the fact that if you look at two brains that show the same kind of pathology, they may show very different clinical features. I think this is certainly true for CTE as well. I think there are certain individuals who may have a seemingly pathological buildup of proteins in the brain who may not show the same kind of behavioral features as another person who has the same level of pathological buildup or volume loss or things like that. And so I think focusing on the ways in which they're similar, I think can kind of assuage some of this concern that people are really struggling with right now about CTE. I think there's this idea that, that there are these people who experience debilitating symptoms quite early on from CTE. And I think that is a very valid expression of that disorder that is really troubling. And I think people see that, and I think you have to kind of extrapolate on the data that you have. And so it's hard to see that as an example of what CTE looks like rather than generically what CTE is. And so I think thinking of that heterogeneity in clinical outcomes that we see with Alzheimer's disease, I think we could certainly say the same thing might apply to CTE. We might see people with quite extensive damage in their brains who maybe never show behavioral symptoms of CTE. That's certainly the case with Alzheimer's disease. I used to go to some of the clinical pathological conferences in the neurology department at Columbia when I was there for my postdoc, and we'd regularly see these, brain slices of someone who had passed away, who clearly had Alzheimer's pathology riddling their brains. I mean, it was very clear that this person was quite late stage in Alzheimer's disease and passed away from that disorder. But their clinical symptoms were quite minimal up until the very end. And I think that happens all the time in kind of these more, I guess, like storied, longer longer duration of research, neurodegenerative diseases, and there's no reason to think that the same thing won't be happening with CTE as well. So I think focusing on those features that may be similar between the two types of diseases, I think is important, and also focusing on the interventions that work in Alzheimer's disease. So we know that there are certain cognitive interventions or physical activity interventions or social support interventions that really can kind of prolong functional independence in people who have Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, which we think of as being kind of the predecessor to Alzheimer's disease, kind of that happens earlier in life. We know that these things work in Alzheimer's disease to some effect, and so there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't also potentially have behavioral benefits in CTE or those who are concerned about having CTE as well.
I think it's really important to just kind of reflect back on what you said about, so in Alzheimer's research, there is a lot of evidence now that the disease presentation doesn't always match the outcome, right? Is what you're saying. We've also had where they've studied healthy brains. So they're able to actually look at the incidence rate of Alzheimer's. And I think what's really important in the CTE research is that it is so groundbreaking, and it is so important so that we can start to understand the impact of multiple impacts over time. And also, the evidence is not there yet where they're comparing healthy norms and the amount of CTE to people who present with symptoms. And so we end up with really these severe cases. A family donates the brain to science in advance because their family member is going downhill. And so, not to discredit any of it, I would never do that. But for the fear mongering that ends up happening with people selling auxiliary treatments and all of this other nonsense that can happen in the concussion space, we just don't know what is the correlation between pathology and expectation. And so to live our lives also, someone who's had 13 head injuries and has some chronic impairment, I can't live my life worrying about what that long-term outcome is going to look like, because we don't actually have any diagnostic tools while we're alive, and we don't have any prognostic tools of, okay, you have level 1 CTE, and so this is what your outcome is going to be. And when we see a New York Times article, I love New York Times, but like when we see an article that has this really big heading, we want to remember that there's a lot of depth of context of what we don't know so that people don't spiral off the deep end. It's about cognitive reserve. It's about treating your symptoms. It's about staying active and healthy and socially engaged. And then we kind of have to just wait and see what happens on that back end. Is that a fair sort of summary of that?
Yes, that summarizes my rambling perfectly. I think there's so much that you have to, when you identify a new disease, it makes so much sense to focus on that extreme worst case scenario first. I think you have to be able to speak to the kind of severe versions of the disorder in order to then backtrack and kind of fill in the other pieces of it. I think that's exactly what we've seen with CTE. We've started with kind of the big cases, and now we're starting to kind of work back and see, who does go on to get CTE and who doesn't. And I think a lot of where kind of my lab's work is coming in is there has been a huge focus on obviously those who have the highest levels of exposure, those who are professional athletes, those who are elite athletes, D1 college athletes, who have that kind of very intense and very long duration of exposure to this injury risk. And there has been so little work done on former high school athletes. So when I first was kind of trying to figure out what my lab was going to focus on, I looked at the numbers and it's like 1 million kids or just over 1 million kids every single year play high school football. And that's just football. That's not including all collision sports or all contact sports or anything. It's about 1 million kids. And if you look at the number that go on to participate in college football, it's around 70 to 80,000. So of that million, about 7% go on to actually play collegiate football. And of that 7% that go on to play collegiate football, I think about 1% go on to play in the NFL. So we see this huge attrition after high school, and yet high school has kind of this big level of participation and is a relatively understudied demographic of people who are experiencing the same kind of sport as people who go on to play in college in the NFL. Obviously, different level of competition, but it's still the same sport and it's susceptible to similar types of injuries. And we've kind of just focused so much on this kind of elite level of participation that we've ignored the more common level of participation. And the times I get asked questions about, should I let my kid play football? Is that something I should be concerned about? It's the parent of like a 6-year-old, 7-year-old who the kid says, I like watching football and I want to play football. And the question is, should they let them go on to play football? And my honest answer is, I don't know. Like, I really don't know. If you think that your kid's going to
have you ever seen a 6-year-old football? Okay, I will tell you, having worked as an athletic trainer on the sidelines of 6-year-old football, I would not let my child play 6-year-old football for none of the reasons that you would think of. The weight of that helmet on that little head gives me like chronic neck pain to even think about. And the injuries, like the crazy injuries of orthopedic, never mind brain, that we would watch. Sure. I mean, like, there's a reason kids used to play flag football or touch football until middle school, right? Like, just the weight of the equipment is enough to wake me up in the middle of the night thinking about what that does to kids.
How old is Charlie now?
Charlie's 3.5. He's not playing football.
Not quite there.
He'll do swimming. He's got ADHD. He needs to do sports that just burn off energy. He can play soccer. He needs to just run for an hour. Okay, so I know we have to let you go soon, but I did have a couple of questions. Oh, also, you can donate your brain to science. Ideally, you don't give it anytime soon, but there are actually brain banks. Mine has been pledged for several years, but there are brain banks where you, especially women, can pledge your brain to science so that we can start to round out some of those pieces. And there's very specific things they have to follow if you are going to donate your brain to a brain bank. So you can definitely look that up. Pink Concussion used to have one. The university, Boston University used to have one. So there are places that you can go for that resource.
I just want to jump in here. You mentioned, sorry, I'm late on this, but you mentioned TES, which I looked up myself, which is traumatic encephalopathy syndrome. So just wanted to, in case somebody didn't want to know what TES stood for, but I'm way late on this. But anyway, so go ahead.
No, I appreciate that, and I'm so sorry for just dropping that and then running away from it.
No problem. I was looking to bring your thing, and I was like, what is TES?
I'm so sorry.
The last question I have for you before we let you go was, I wanted to know a little bit more about these fMRI studies, because I know that's one of the things you're doing in your lab, which is incredible since they are a small fortune. I don't even know how you're getting the funding to do studies for large volumes of that. But can you kind of set the stage for what is an fMRI, and then what are some of the limitations? Because there's movement in the clinical field to use something that actually isn't showing to have as much benefit as places are saying it has in indirecting treatment. And also that doesn't mean that it can't be beneficial in the long run. And so what, as a researcher, would you say, will give us kind of the highlights of what it is, what it does, that sort of thing?
Great question. So fMRI is basically a type of scan that we can do in an MRI machine that can tell us information about where blood has recently flowed in the brain. So essentially with a standard structural MRI, which is very commonly used clinically, you're looking for gross structural abnormalities. So areas where there may have been blood pooling or loss of brain volume, things like that, or small cysts that may crop up in the brain, tumors, obviously, any kinds of pockets of changes in brain shape or size. fMRI, on the other hand, actually capitalizes upon this kind of unique property of the brain where we know that brain regions that were recently active tend to kind of hyperbolically demand more blood right after they were active. Essentially, they use up all of the resources that they have and they like scream to the circulatory system, like, send me more blood. I'm freaking out right here. I have nothing, like I need it. And basically your circulatory system sends all that blood up there and you get this rush of blood to this one region that was recently active. And so we can actually start to kind of track that with functional MRI in kind of interesting ways. And so there are multiple types of fMRI that you can do. There's resting state fMRI where someone's just laying in the scanner, basically just letting their mind wander. And then there's also task-based fMRI where someone's actually engaging in some kind of activity or task while they're in the scanner. This is kind of complicated to do. It ends up being this very strange like mirror system where you're staring at like a mirror and you're seeing things behind you basically, but it is possible and it's a pretty cool technique. And so they're helpful for different things. So the resting state fMRI can be helpful to look at the way in which regions of the brain work together at any given point in time. There's that old kind of myth that you only use 15% of your brain or whatever, which is completely wrong. You're using your entire brain basically every single moment of every single day. And the regions of your brain actually work together in kind of predictable synchronous ways. It's kind of nice. You got little teams kind of helping you out up there. But so resting state can be helpful for kind of illuminating the way in which your brain organizes itself, even when you're just kind of relaxing, engaging in mind-wandering thought. And then during a task, we can actually look at how different types of cognitive processes can change the way that you use different parts of your brain. So if you're doing a memory task, having kind of a harder versus easier component of the task, or having a part where you're trying to remember something versus where you're just kind of looking at pictures passively, you can start to probe how the brain kind of uses different regions differently based on the cognitive demands at hand. And so this is helpful in kind of looking at just one, what types of brain regions the person uses, but also especially in the case of, you know, concussion or head injury or aging or things like that, you can not only look at how the brain responds to that cognitive challenge, but then also how it may differ based on the types of symptoms someone is experiencing or the type of condition that they have kind of been volunteered into. So this is kind of a fascinating tool to be able to see how people use their brain differently. And in some instances at kind of a broader participation level, it has been linked to kind of prognostic indicators of changes over time. So even though you may have two people, or I guess two groups of people in the MRI scanner who don't show any behavioral differences, so they're all showing kind of similar performance on tasks, same cognitive levels of functioning. When they do the scan, they might be engaging different regions of their brain in order to do the task. And the degree to which they do it may actually inform who may or may not go on to develop cognitive complaints over time. The big caveat that I'm going to give for all fMRI studies is that these are done at quite large participant levels. So it's at the order of 20 participants or 100 participants. We're not able to kind of distill this down to the level of the single participant just yet. fMRI has a variety of limitations, one of which is just the fact that we're looking at a very large brain volume and looking at differences in blood flow across that volume. And so kind of making reliable statistical comparisons can be kind of challenging to do when you're dealing with just one person versus a whole host of people. So I think the big caveat with fMRI is it can be really helpful to kind of probe regions of the brain that may be associated with different types of cognitive processes or that may be associated with likelihood of cognitive challenges over time. But unfortunately, where we're at right now, it's mostly at kind of the group level rather than at the single subject level.
I think that's really helpful.
I just keep questions about your lab there. I read you mentioned the sample size. I read those briefly in one of your papers about sample size of like 9-10-year-old athletes, and it was like our 8 and 9 year old athletes. It was like athletes is for 8 9 stretch, but participants. But there's like numbers like 1,200 or some ridiculous, something huge. But anyway, but what your lab is called the ATHINA Lab, which I marked on earlier. But what does this stand for? And what exactly? Well, first, how's it spelled? And what does it stand for? What are you doing?
Yeah. So it's spelled ATHINA, and it stands for Assessing Traumatic Head Injury with Neurocognitive Approaches. So I kind of had to shoehorn that in. I feel like because I'm Greek, I have to make everything about being Greek. And so I was able to figure it out.
Yeah.
But essentially, we're interested in the impacts of head injury and assessing those using what I refer to as neurocognitive approaches, basically using MRI imaging, both structural and functional imaging, as well as batteries of cognitive tasks and assessments in order to kind of characterize how the brain looks as well as how it's functioning.
One more question about that. Sorry. The top rate one the two-part memory test or 2 stage. So what is that?
So there are so many different memory tasks that we can kind of use to probe memory function in general. The one that we're currently using in the context of our fMRI scan right now is what we refer to as a face name memory task. And so our face name memory task, basically we show participants a face and we give it a name, a fairly common name. And so we ask them, essentially, is this name a good fit for the face? And we tell them they're going to have to remember it. Then they do like a brief shape matching tasks to kind of like clear out their short-term memory. And then we then show them the face and we ask them to remember the name associated with it.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Sorry, Lauren, you can go ahead now.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to have to wrap up here, but I did have one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about with the fMRI study. So I'm a dysautonomia researcher, so autonomic dysfunction, and especially post-concussion and long COVID. And so one of my questions has kind of been noodling around in my head about the fMRI is how much that cerebral autoregulation dysfunction ends up messing with the fMRI findings, right? Because if the fMRI is showing an area asking for blood flow, it would be really interesting to see how that disruption is related to pathology, areas that are weak versus a brain's ability to meet demand from an at-use area. And then how does that change over time? Like as a person gets better from their dysautonomia, do they show an improvement in cognitive impairment, not because we did cognitive rehab, but because their cerebral autoregulation improves? So it just kind of, that's one of the things I've been really wondering about. And I know that really requires some big worlds to come together. But do you have any thoughts? I know I'm really putting you on the spot about that, but just selfishly, do you have any thoughts about that at all?
So the first thing I can think of, and this is very naive, my space is mostly the like task-based and resting state functional imaging. I've dabbled a little bit in structural and other types of imaging, but not as confident in it. So you'll have to take my my tempered cautionary tale here. But essentially there is a type of MRI scan called a perfusion imaging scan, and it's also called arterial spin labeling. And so essentially what it looks at is actually the flow of blood across the brain. And so what it does is it basically is able to kind of like, from a technical perspective, magnetically label blood coming into the brain and look at where it goes to once it kind of reaches the brain, essentially. And so the first thing I thought of when you said that was kind of looking at just blood flow across the brain. And you can look at regional differences in blood flow and kind of delayed kind of reach of blood flow to the brain at a very kind of fine-grained perspective, similarly to how you can look at activation in an fMRI scan. So my first thought would be if you could develop some kind of study looking at perfusion and kind of blood flow to the brain and compare that to the functional activity that's being used, and then look at that across recovery as well. But that would be my brief stab at that question, but I don't know if it totally.
If you could just study that for us, that'd be great.
Sure,
thank you so much. Yeah, just add that to your to your list.
Maybe.
All right. Well, I hate to end this conversation. This is fascinating. I feel like we could talk for several more hours. But we have to say goodbye to our listeners and give them a break. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking your time and checking in with us and learning all about Dr. Varangis's research. It is fascinating. There's so much excitement coming out of her lab and all of her team that she's working with. Please be sure to check back into the next episode of Chronically, and just thank you again so much.
Fine,
Thank you
thanks,
so much
Freddie.
for having me.